After getting asked multiple times to talk about the game in my previous Souls videos, here it is. The definitive Dark Souls 2 review. Dark Souls 2 is a very somber Souls game. While Dark Souls 1 was very lucrative and has a warm and welcoming atmosphere, despite the hostility of the world, Dark Souls 2 feels way grittier. And that's not a coincidence. The areas of Dark Souls 2 are way less saturated and colorful. The world is more torn apart than Dark Souls 1's world, and it's clear that we're not in the same place as Lordran. As we enter Lordran, the hub area is warm and welcoming, shown by the glimmering blue sky that shines through the branches of Firelink Shrine. But in Dark Souls 2 it's barren, but still very beautiful. A seaside cliff with a firekeeper, looking out into the world, the sun shining upon Majula, and an enticing but a serene melody playing in the background. Out of all the Souls games, Dark Souls 2 feels the most lonely, the most deserted, and the most barren of them all. There's just something about the unsaturated and worn down buildings, the dying grass on the ground, and the rain that befalls the castles. Dark Souls 2's world is the most unwelcoming one that I've stepped into. And as dark as that may sound, it's very unique. Instead of showing how hostile the world is through the enemies, like Dark Souls 1, Dark Souls 2 puts it in the forefront of your vision and shows how dead the world is becoming. This would become more and more prevalent as the series went into its final game, Dark Souls 3, but I'll talk about that in the third installment's own video. Drangleic is very unfamiliar from the get-go. We can see the similarities between it and Lordran, but it stands out in its own way. Going over most of the locations, I find Dark Souls 2's locations to be the most odd out of the series. All of them feel tricky in their own way, and to be fair, all Souls games exhibit this. But it's different with Dark Souls 2. The world feels very empty compared to the other games, and this brings a weird, lonely feeling to the world. With Dark Souls 1 and 3, you're alone in your mindset and journey. But in Dark Souls 2, you're literally alone. The world is more hostile than ever. It's like being in a world that you have no control over. And for some reason, the task of linking the fire feels way more sinister in this game. Like the stakes are higher this time. But it also feels like linking the fire won't mean anything. This is one of the most intriguing things in this game. Linking in the fire truly feels meaningless, unlike in Dark Souls 1, where we see the direct consequences of our actions, in the characters, the world, and the story. But in Dark Souls 2, we're in a completely unfamiliar world, split off from the land we're familiar with, which shows how useless linking the fire is. It only prolongs an age of endless suffering. This is something that I haven't felt in the other Souls games, because the endings made me feel like there was something more to come out of linking the flame, or letting it die out. But in Dark Souls 2, it just feels meaningless, and don't get me wrong, this is not a nitpick. It's a feature. It's what makes Dark Souls 2 stand out. It's what makes it feel special. Dark Souls 2 is a good game, but not a good Souls game. Most of that critique lies in the combat and mechanics of the game, which I felt like were very misguided because Miyazaki wasn't the director of the game. There's just the slightest feeling that something's off. I can't place my finger on it, but the game just feels off, not in the world, but in the mechanics. Maybe it's the janky animations, the more dated UI, the leveling system. Maybe it's all those things, but it feels off. And this might just be a thing that I feel, but I know that many others feel the same way. That the game doesn't feel like a true sequel, instead feeling like a spin-off. And there absolutely are things to appreciate in this game. The combat still feels good, the animations aren't all that janky, and the gameplay is fun. But to be honest, it didn't live up to the standards of FromSoftware's other top-selling titles. Going over the combat, the bosses were quite fun, but most bosses are very forgettable. I could whip out a notepad and write down all the bosses I remember from each Souls game, and I'd be able to write down maybe 8 or 10 bosses from Dark Souls 2. The bosses in combat lack fluid gameplay. and it's clear that Miyazaki's overall influence on the game was not apparent, as he was focused on Bloodborne at the time. The leveling system felt off balance. Adaptability is a joke in this game, and some bosses were painstakingly mind-numbing when compared to other Souls games. Don't get me wrong, there are still bosses that stand out from the others, but even the good bosses are overshadowed by the bad hitboxes, the enemies that accompany them, and the horrible run-ups that you have to get through before getting to the bosses. You're more likely to die from the run to the boss than the boss itself. The combat is still enjoyable, as most builds in the game feel fun. Enemy variety is plentiful, and again, some bosses were very good, but I just can't help but feel disappointed by how misguided this game felt. There is still one thing that shines really bright in this game: the soundtrack. Dear God, this soundtrack is amazing. It's not better than the other Souls games, but it's very unique. Majula's theme, Sir Alon's boss music, all the other orchestral masterpieces that Motoi Sakuraba and the rest of the music team cooked up are absolutely gorgeous. I can't help but start to have flashbacks to this game when I listen to the soundtrack. It's mind-bogglingly good, but sadly, it's one of the things that I remember more fondly in the game. The story of the game was very interesting when I played it for the first time. Where are we? Where's Anorlando? Is that Ornstein? What is this dragon-ridden kingdom? There were so many questions racing through my head as I played this game. And this is perhaps the thing that Dark Souls does best: intrigue the player with its story, atmosphere, and world. And goddamn is it good at doing that. Every location I stepped through, I had no idea what to expect except death and mystery. This game's atmosphere is fantastic, in its own way. It's extremely unique, and again, it's sadly one of the very few things that I remember fondly about this game. To give a definitive rating, Dark Souls 2, when compared to the rest of the gaming world, is a solid 8 to 9 out of 10, and it's a very good standalone game. But when compared to the rest of FromSoftware's titles, it doesn't live up to the legend of Dark Souls 1, the sorrow of Dark Souls 3, the combat of Sekiro, the world of Bloodborne, or the experience of Elden Ring. When compared to these games, it's merely a 7.5 out of 10. Dark Souls 2 is still a game that you absolutely should play. In fact, you can completely forget about what I said in this video if you haven't played it. But if you have played it, tell me if you agree or disagree with the things that I said in this game. But that's all for now. This was my second video on the Souls franchise, and I'll be continuing to make more of these. So, expect to see a Dark Souls 3 video sooner than later. And remember, don't you dare go hollow.